Welcome to the Center for Humanities Research. This is called the IAAM Lab. IAAM is Isi Hausa for It Is Jumping, and it speaks to how we think of different disciplines and different activities that we do connecting together. I'm just going to say a few words about the center and about the Irish Studies Chair, which is the Charlotte Maxeke-Robinson Chair in Irish Studies, and then a brief introduction of Daryl. I've only got about 30 pages, so won't take too long. So the center was established in 2006 and leads an interfaculty and cross-disciplinary inquiry into the role of culture in deepening the meaning of freedom globally after the experience of apartheid. It's produced research on post-apartheid freedom that explores the relationship between the human, the kinetic arts, and technology in our contemporary world, especially as these lead to transcending the legacies of apartheid. As the only South African national flagship project in the humanities, the Center has convened a national conversation and network on key concepts in humanities research that deal with questions of new ecologies of the subject, aesthetic education, and the relationship between the human and technology. Mindful of what it means to be a university in Africa and alert to the local and the international challenges we inherit and inhabit, along with post-colonial societies around the world, the Center's orientation hinges on three methods of work: the invention of concepts and production of new knowledge appropriate for our times, supporting the effective translation of research into the public domain, which this lecture series through the chair is part of, and placing fellows and artists to work alongside researchers to deepen understanding of shared societal challenges. The CHR understands this as a method that enables focused and inventive inquiry towards renewing the pedagogic projects of academic disciplines, considering emerging research themes and expanding the range of research questions to enhance the training and mobility of young people from rural, peri-urban, and across the Cape, trying to undo the entrapment of the geographies of apartheid spatial plan. This articulates into partnerships across the city, across the nation, and internationally. And one of those core partnerships is with the Trinity Long Room Hub, which is at Trinity College, Dublin, and it was in partnership with them that we first proposed to the Department of Foreign Affairs, the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs, to establish this research chair. And it draws its inspiration from two significant women in the struggle for freedom and non-partitioned futures. Charlotte Maxeke is the first black South African woman science graduate. She graduated with a BSc in 1903 from Wilberforce University in the US, and was one of the founders of the women's movement in the struggle against apartheid. She's the subject of a major study that's being published by one of our next generation researchers. She's now based at the University of Fort Hare, Tazama April. And her book was the inspiration for the award-winning puppetry production by our resident artist, the Okwanda Puppetry Art and Design Collective, on Maxeke, called This Work Is Not For Yourselves. And the second woman is Mary Robinson, who maybe needs less introduction to the crowd that's here today, but Mary was the former president of the Irish Republic and a prominent member of the Council of Elders, who's recognized for her steadfast fight for human rights and her deep-seated opposition to apartheid. In its 3 years, this reciprocal chair has hosted scholars and artists like Jane Allmeyer, Owen McNamee, Ruth Barton, Rita Duffy, Margaret Kelleher, and Valmont Lane has been hosted in Dublin as part of the reciprocal component. Now it's my honor to introduce Daryl, Dr. Daryl Hendley Rooney, who, together with the center's Pramesh Lalu, who you'll find loitering towards the middle of the room, loitering, it's a great word, behave myself, is curating an exhibition. So the two of them are curating an exhibition at the Little Museum of Dublin on the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement. And the exhibition will open, I think it's in May in Dublin next year?
Yes, around springtime.
Somewhere around
I have to always remember it's southern or northern hemispheric springtime, so yeah, probably around Easter time, May.
and then round about our spring, so August in South Africa, here in this building. So Daryl is a historian in residence at the Little Museum of Dublin on St. Stephen's Green. He earned his BA in English and History, as well as his MA in Medieval Studies at the University College Dublin. And his doctoral research was completed in the School of Histories and Humanities at Trinity College Dublin, where he was a fellow of the Trinity Long Room Hub for Arts and Humanities Research. His thesis examined chroniclers and historians' attitudes towards Ireland and its people during the Plantagenet rule in England from 1169 to 1252. And that's a different talk, right? But there are words in there that I have no idea what they mean. So he's a medievalist by training, and he helps to convene the exhibitions and historical research of the Little Museum of Dublin. The lecture today is based on Daryl and Pramesh's preliminary explorations of the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement and its holdings, a collection that we understand holds many surprises and has been, unfortunately, underexplored as a resource for showing the importance of the relationship between Ireland and South Africa. So join me in welcoming Daryl.
I'd just like to say, just to echo Moritz's words in terms of the importance of this chair and bilateral connections between Ireland and South Africa. Obviously, the Charlotte Maxeke-Robinson Chair, co-funded by the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs and UWC, provides researchers with an opportunity to explore and celebrate the past, present and future connections between Ireland and South Africa, reflecting upon key themes related to our shared experiences, particularly solidarity, reconciliation, and peace building. I'd like to sincerely thank the Charlotte Maxeke-Robinson Research Chair Committee for inviting me here to Cape Town. This weather, though, I have to say, it's getting too hot for me at the moment. I'm surviving, thriving, hopefully. Sincere thanks to colleagues in the Centre for Humanities Research, in particular, Martha van Bever Dunker, Valmont Lane, Heidi Grunebaum, obviously who's not with us at the moment, Kim Gurney, Samuel Longford upstairs, Tumalang, Walla Hulere down the back, Lamise Lakin and Michaela Felix. I'd also like to sincerely thank colleagues and staff at UWC Robben Island Mayabuye Archives, particularly Andre Mohammed, Babalwa Solwande and Masachaba Masilo. So really, this exhibition that we're working on together in partnership, it emerged out of a meeting in the Trinity Long Room Hub in Dublin. And that's where I met that man there, Pramesh Lalu. And it's thanks to that man that this chair actually exists. So, I mean, those connections between Jane Allmeyer and Pramesh through the Consortium for Humanities Centres was key to developing this. And while Pramesh was based in the Long Room Hub for 3 months doing research, there as research fellow, I was but a humble doctoral researcher, and I finished my PhD there. And we met and we connected, and we'd always thought that perhaps in the future there could be some way that we could work together. And basically this, I suppose, is the fruition in some ways of that connection, of that network between Trinity College Dublin and also the other intellectual institutions in Ireland and here in South Africa. So it's this exhibition, Together Apart, the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement. So for the last 3 weeks, I won't bore you with the details, but myself and Pramesh have been trawling through 87 boxes of material that Kader Asmal and his wife Louise Asmal brought back here to Cape Town in the early 1990s. As Moritz says, it's an underutilised resource for, I suppose, exploring various themes related to the anti-apartheid struggle. So what I'm going to do today, this afternoon, I'm going to go through some of the themes that we'll be looking at in the exhibition, in particular those of exile, solidarity, boycott and freedom. And I'm going to use some of our findings in the archives here to illustrate some of our findings. So on the 9th of May, 1994, the first session of the first Parliament was convened in the Republic of South Africa. This was symbolic. Since the Union of 1910, parliamentary sessions had been convened in South Africa for more than 80 years. Protocol suggested that this should have been the first session of the 10th Parliament. But this was different. history was being rewritten. After almost 50 years of segregation, all South Africans were now in control of their political destinies. It was a fresh start, a new beginning. Sitting on the government benches was Kader Asmal, academic jurist and civil rights campaigner who had been appointed Minister for Water Affairs and Forestry in Nelson Mandela's cabinet. And it is at this point that I want to take a slightly unusual turn and focus on Kader Asmal's fashion sense on that fateful day in May 1994. Now, in the prologue of his memoir, Politics in My Blood, Asmal recalled that historic day in the new Parliament in some detail, including what he wore. A brand new suit and this Trinity College Dublin tie. Now, few and far between would probably have noticed Kader's tie on that day. There were far more pressing political matters at hand, but nonetheless for Kader, this was an important symbol of not only his time spent teaching law in Trinity College for over 25 years, but also his tireless efforts to continue the struggle against apartheid while exiled in his adopted home in Ireland. Now, Kader was born on the 8th of October 1934 in the small rural town of Stanger in what was then Natal. His father was a shopkeeper, his mother was a homemaker, and young Kader was raised in a vibrant lower middle class family, which although not overtly political at that point, his parents widely encouraged debate within the family home. And despite being effectively illiterate, Kader's father encouraged him to read and read widely, presenting his young son with books on colonial Angola and Ireland. As he recalled in his memoir, quote, "My father told me a lot about the Irish and their struggle. He was fervent about the fight against colonialism generally, and spoke especially vividly about the Irish efforts over the centuries to shrug off the yoke of English power," end quote. By the age of 12, Kader had read Labour rights activist James Connolly's Labour in Irish History. While still a school student, Kader had met Chief Albert Luthuli, the then president of the African National Congress and a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. This meeting would profoundly shape Kader's life. Now, in 1953, while studying for his teacher's diploma in Durban, Asmal strengthened his bonds with Luthuli, who had by then been banned and confined to his home in the area of Grootville near Stanger. And Luthuli became both a mentor and a source of inspiration for the young Asmal. While teaching, Kader had continued his own education, earning a Bachelor of Arts degree through the University of South Africa. Then in 1959, driven by his passion for justice, he travelled to London to study law at the London School of Economics. He graduated 4 years later and qualified as a barrister in both Britain and in Ireland. And it's because of his political activities, as well as the fact he had married a white English woman named Louise Parkinson, who many of you will know, which meant he was effectively barred from South Africa due to the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act of 1949. Asmal could not return home. The Asmals decided to move to Dublin in 1963 when Kader took up a lectureship in the law department of Trinity College, Dublin, but he had actually visited Dublin for the first time 4 years earlier. According to Kader, it was a memorable, if inelegant, affair. It was Christmas 1959, and he was travelling by ferry to Dunleary in Dublin to meet some former students. The journey across the Irish Sea was bitterly cold, as it normally is. There was nowhere to sit, and it was quite crammed, with men and women obviously returning home for the festivities of Christmas. He was tired, cold, a bit homesick, and he slumped down and he sat on the floor. That's when a fellow Irish traveller approached Kader and leaned over and said to him, "Why are you looking so miserable?" The fellow handed Kader a bottle of Guinness and then another. The witty exchanges and laughter grew apace, and the Guinness flowed. As Kader recalled in his memoir, quote, "Before I knew it, I was staggering ashore and in love with Ireland and the Irish already. My former students looked at me in utter amazement. They knew me from South Africa as a neatly dressed man, particular about my language and my appearance. Instead, they found me happy and dishevelled. I stumbled off the ferry with my overcoat in my left hand, my jacket in my right, my tie all askew, and sober as a seaman on home leave. They were completely taken aback. Ireland does that to you. It overwhelms you with its empathy and its generosity, end quote. Kader took the struggle against apartheid with him to Dublin, where he and his wife Louise helped found the IAAM, the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement, in April 1964. The IAM was founded at a time when the global campaign against South Africa's apartheid regime was gaining international traction. The movement emerged from a unique intersection of Ireland's own anti-colonial identity, its strong humanitarian tradition, and the influence of exiled South Africans living in Dublin. At its heart was the belief that Ireland, as a small nation with a history of oppression, had a moral duty to stand against racial injustice wherever it occurred. Now, among the IAM's early members and sponsors were notable Irish figures, such as Mary Robinson, who would later become President of Ireland, first female President of Ireland as well, Michael D. Higgins, also a future President and a passionate advocate for human rights, and Dr. Noel Brown, he was a politician and a very well-known reformer in Ireland, a social reformer. The group was also supported by trade unionists, students and clergy who were moved by the parallels between Ireland's struggles for freedom and South Africa's fight against apartheid. Now, what was perhaps most interesting about the membership of the movement was its ability to break down barriers within Irish society itself. And it bridged political and religious divides. People from nationalist, unionist and socialist backgrounds often stood side by side in support of boycotts, for example, strikes, and they found common moral ground in opposition to racism and the apartheid state. For instance, President Terence Mackay was president of the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement. He was a Presbyterian minister. He was the Reverend Terence Mackay. He was also professor of Irish at Trinity College, Dublin, and obviously a colleague of Kader's there. There was also Rodney Rice, who you'll see here. That's outside in the background. That's Radio Telefí Sharon, our national broadcaster, RTE. That's the campus there in Donnybrook. And Rodney Rice, he was a journalist who had visited South Africa in 1979 to report on its segregated society. He had been born in White Abbey in County Antrim, and he was reared in a unionist family. And despite being offered a place in Oxford, he decided to study at Trinity College as he wanted to understand life in the Republic, which was predominantly Catholic at that point. It was this profound sense of wanting to learn more about his fellow man that led him to produce and present RTE's Worlds Apart series. It was a current affairs programme focusing on global poverty, and he produced and presented that for 23 years. Now, in 1981, Rodney's coverage of apartheid actually led to him being banned from South Africa for a decade. Now, he died only recently during the COVID-19 pandemic, 2021, and Rodney's son, Owen, had recalled his father telling him, quote unquote, "I've seen conflicts all over the world and they are all the same. It's always about one group of people trying to rule over another, and it's always the innocent who suffer." Now, right from its founding, the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement quickly became one of the most active anti-apartheid organisations in Europe. Its early work focused on raising public awareness about the brutality of the apartheid regime through lectures, rallies and cultural events. The movement urged the Irish government to take a firm stance against South Africa's racial policies and to cut political, economic and sporting ties with the apartheid regime. One of its most visible campaigns was the boycott of South African goods, which began in 1964 and spread widely through Ireland's trade unions and student movements. The IAAM also played a leading role in opposing visits by South African sports teams, as I mentioned, arguing that participation in international sport gave legitimacy to a racist state. This campaign reached a high point in the 1970s and 1980s when the movement's protests successfully pressured the Irish government to adopt stronger sanctions against apartheid South Africa. Under Asmal's leadership in particular, the IAM maintained close links with the African National Congress and with other anti-apartheid organisations around the world. It was both a moral voice and a practical force for change, reminding Ireland of its global responsibilities. Now, many Irish anti-apartheid campaigners were motivated to political action by the shared experience of colonial trauma. Their view of black South Africans' oppression was sympathetic, not pitiful, and I think that's really key. Irish people like Margaret Rice, who was actually the wife of Rodney Rice, who I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, she was moved to join the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement because, quote unquote, the oppression people faced was so stark and so brutal. And I was actually having listened to her husband's segment on the segregated South Africa that really changed a lot of people's opinion in Ireland and led to a lot of people joining the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement, particularly in the 80s. While individual stories of resilience and resolve are important, we must not slip into the narrative focus of great men and great women. I know I mentioned specific people there, but there were a lot of people involved in the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement and in other anti-apartheid movements across the world. And indeed, the anti-apartheid struggle requires individual tenacity. That's obviously, there's no doubt about that. But the strength and success of action necessitates people power. During his opening address at the Churches and Racialism Conference in 1971, then chairman of the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement, Father Austin Flannery, he was a Dominican, he was from the Order of Preachers, he was president of the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement. He said, quote unquote, "Our vice chairman, Mr. Kader Asmal, is by now as Irish as any of us here, but he has the further distinction of being a South African. Without him and his wife Louise, there would be no conference and probably no Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement." Now, one thing I want to say before I actually get to the boycott, I just want to show you these. The problem with, well, the happy problem is there, and Premesh will tell you this, there are incredible photographs. So just so you're aware, 90% of the photographs that you'll see in these slides actually all derive from the Moyabuye archives, okay, and the photographs contain the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement. But one example, I suppose, of solidarity, particularly early on and even before the Dunn Store strikes, was in 1983. One second. I told you I'm technologically challenged as a medievalist. Yeah, here we go. So on the 26th of June 1983, over 1,000 people had gathered in Merrion Square in Dublin to witness the unveiling of Elizabeth Frink's bronze artwork tribute head, this here. And this was basically, it was created in honour of Nelson Mandela. So this is 1983. It was a day that Seamus Heaney, the poet, a Nobel Prize winner obviously as well, he had read some fitting poetry. The Irish traditional music band, the Chieftains, who some of you may know, performed before the crowd, which included Kader Asmal. As you can see there, there's the Chieftains playing up there, including Paddy Maloney. There's the tribute head on display for the crowd. And Sean McBride, who was a founder of Amnesty International, he was also there in the crowd. There's Sean McBride there. So he was, as I said, a founding member of Amnesty International. And the chief representative of the ANC in Britain and Ireland, Ruth Mompati, you probably noticed her there. There she is. She addressed the crowd and she was also present as well. And she outlined her belief that, quote unquote, this gesture would give the South African people courage to carry on for the liberation of their country. Now, while there was widespread support for the anti-apartheid movement across Ireland, it was not all rose-tinted. I think that's important to be said. Indeed, it would be actually deceitful of me if I wasn't to acknowledge that there was criticism of the movement. And the IAAM collection does contain some examples of letters expressing disdain for the movement for a variety of reasons. One letter in particular, myself and Premesh, was addressed to Louise. It was actually quite shocking. And yeah, it shocked me when I read it, to be quite honest. But thankfully it was unique in its own regard, and most of the letters in the collection, which you'll see as I go through some examples, are far more civilised. Now, I'd like to move on and look at the boycott, which is obviously in association with the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement is quite well known, particularly the economic boycott, which involved the Dunn Store strikers. So this is our outspan fruit there, who many of you will know. So, although technically an economic protest, the 1984-1987 strike by workers at Dunn Stores in Dublin became a defining moment of Irish anti-apartheid activism and an emblem of moral resistance. When young shop workers refused to handle South African produce, They were suspended from their jobs. Their action drew nationwide attention and won praise from Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela. It was the 19th of July 1984, and that woman there, Mary Manning, who many of you will have heard of, she was just 21 years old. She arrived for her shift as a checkout operator or shop assistant at Dunnes Stores on Henry Street in Dublin. And it seemed like any other day for Mary until she noticed something unusual. There were managers, Dunnes Stores managers, standing around the tills, and a lot more than usual, and some were suspected of having been brought in for other branches, which was unusual. They weren't familiar to a lot of the general staff workers there, and there seemed to be a bit of tension in the air. And not long into her shift, a customer came to Mary's checkout with a simple purchase: 2 grapefruits. Outspan grapefruits from South Africa. But for Mary, this was no ordinary transaction. Her trade union, IDATU, the Irish Distributive and Administrative Trade Union, had issued a directive to its members: do not handle goods from apartheid South Africa. The union's stand was clear. They would not support a regime built on racial segregation and oppression. Mary had a choice. She could ring up the sale and move on, or she could stand by her union's directive. Quietly but firmly, she refused to process the transaction. And that decision changed everything. Within hours, she and 9 of her co-workers, all IDATU members, you'll see them there, were suspended from their jobs. What began as a single act of defiance soon grew into a 3-year struggle between the workers and their employer, Dunnes Stores. Week after week, the young shop workers stood outside the store in protest, often in the rain, holding placards and refusing to back down. Their stand captured public attention across Ireland and far beyond, and what had started as a small workplace dispute became a moral imperative, a demand that Ireland take a firm stand against apartheid. In the end, their persistence paid off. The protest forced the Irish government to become the first Western government to ban South African imports in solidarity with the anti-apartheid movement. So, from one checkout line in Dublin came a ripple that reached all the way to Pretoria. Mary Manning and her colleagues proved that courage and conviction, even from ordinary workers, can challenge systems of power and inspire real political change. Although liberation struggles are often associated with leaders, people like the emancipator of Catholics in Ireland, people like Daniel O'Connell, Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, we must not underestimate people power, the unrecorded masses that buttress and enable the visions of liberation leaders to be realised. Indeed, as Kader Asmal reflected in his memoir, quote, "The real passion came from the ordinary people of Ireland. They were the ones who made our work such a success," end quote. Now, it's interesting because far from being motivated by an inner moral imperative, Mary Manning had admitted that her initial refusal to handle South African goods was in line with the directive from her labour union. So we see a direct influence of trade and labour unionism on working class action in this example. And indeed, Ireland's revolutionary history, particularly during the early decades of the 20th century, is intertwined with the story of the labourer. The strongest supporters of the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement in Ireland came from the Irish Trade Union movement itself. The relationship between the IAAM and the Irish trade unions was a remarkable axis of support and mobilisation for several decades. From Michael Mullen, who was General Secretary of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, to Donal Nevin, General Secretary of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, to the thousands of shop stewards, ordinary members, something about the fight against apartheid had stirred in their hearts. It was the unions who got the boycott campaign in Ireland up and running. It was the unions who gave firepower to the application of the academic, sporting and cultural boycotts by threatening to withdraw their labour. At every turn, the unions were there to support the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement. They formed the backbone of the IAAM, and their material, financial and ideological support added enormous value to the anti-apartheid struggle. Now, the Dunnes Stores strikes obviously will become emblematic of Irish solidarity and the anti-apartheid struggle. No matter the weather, the young and the old alike had gathered with the strikers in the Dunnes Stores. You'll see people of all ilks there, children, older adults. And this was particularly important when morale had ebbed over the years. Now, culturally, the strike resonated far beyond the picket line. Songs, documentaries, and plays were created to commemorate the event, transforming it into a symbol of Irish conscience and courage. It demonstrated that political conviction could be expressed through everyday actions, a theme deeply consistent with the spirit of the cultural boycott, which I'll talk about in a couple of moments. By the time the Irish government banned South African imports in 1987, the cultural and economic campaigns had become inseparable, which we'll see. The boycott campaign was sustained largely by public support and vigilance. In this example from the IAAM collection, we see a concerned citizen write to the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement, informing them of a Dunnes Stores in Limerick who was selling fruit, Granny Smith apples from South Africa. You can see here, enclosed label for bag of apples I bought at Dunnes Stores, Sarsfield Street in Limerick, 30th of July 1983. Perhaps you could have the matter published. So it was that sort of, you see a lot of correspondence, an incredible amount of correspondence in the collection from normal people writing to the movement, informing them of developments, particularly outside of Dublin as well, because the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement, it was actually based for the most part out of Kader and Louise's family home. That was the HQ. It was a bustling place, I'm sure. Now, on the 18th of October 1985, 30-year-old poet and political activist Benjamin Molloy was executed in Pretoria. And in Dublin, Dunnes Stores strikers and others rallied together to protest against his execution. So in many ways, the Dunnes Stores strikers, they weren't just solitary, they weren't just these silos. The Dunnes Stores strikers and just people in general had come together to rally, to protest for other reasons as well. And they basically tied it all together, which is interesting. There's actually that Seamus Heaney at the protest following Molloy's execution. You buy fruit and diamonds, they hang poets. Now, as well as demonstrations outside Dunnes Stores branches, the IAAM also protested outside other organisations as well, such as Barclays Bank, which you can see here. And you can see actually Kader Asmal here rallying the people together, and there's actually Mary Manning as well. So it wasn't just outside Dunnes Stores. These strikers, they all came together outside other businesses as well. So the IAM reach was nothing short of extraordinary. In Ireland, they petitioned businesses and organisations in Ireland itself to sever ties with South Africa, but they were equally industrious in their efforts to contact international businesses. So, for example, there's some of the local examples. So it could have been, authorities like On Board Bonia who look after the dairy industry in Ireland, but also companies as well. Pennies, also known as Primark, Super Quinn, now Super Value today, Tesco, and Fife's fruit importers. But also they were writing to people, major corporations as well, and businesses across the world, Oral-B, Lego, KLM. And the IAM organised conferences, they organised workshops, they organised talks across Ireland, from schools and youth groups and universities to trade union meetings and local government offices. And I think Premesh, I'm sure, will echo this. They were unbelievably prolific in their correspondence. It's quite incredible. To be quite honest, I don't know. Kader must have had somebody else give his lectures, because I don't know how he managed to keep up his lectureship in Trinity College for over 25 years and also sustain the amount of administration that was involved in the IAAM. And Louise, I think in many ways, was particularly prolific and important in that regard. Now, and speaking of Louise, in her reflections on the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement efforts, and this is important, and it goes back to what I was saying about people power earlier, Louise noted, quote, that much of the work was of course not all glamorous, though essential it was to our success. I think of one woman who stood for hours at a time in a garage painfully inking our antiquated duplicating machine and churning out our members' newsletters. Of another who wrote hundreds of envelopes by hand every month for the same newsletter. Of those, mostly women, again, who secretly sent out postal orders to the families of those in South Africa jailed for their part in the struggle, end quote. Now, the 3 decades of IAM operations from approximately 1964 to 1994 coincided with a period of immense transition in Irish society. This was a period when women employed in the civil service were obliged to retire upon marriage. In the 1966 census in Ireland, only 9% of women were recorded as gainfully employed. They were married. In 1996, the Family Law Divorce Act was enacted, which established a legal framework for obtaining divorce in Ireland. And women's membership of the IAAM provided them with a sense of purpose and agency at a time when women's place was, by and large, in the home. And it's in this context that you have the emergence of an offshoot of the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement. It was the Women's Office, and they solely focused, they looked at the plight of South African women. So these are some materials that are related to the involvement of women's organisations in Ireland in their correspondence and the support for the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement, from the Women's Liberation Movement, for example, the Women's Centre. And this is actually quite interesting. You see this one from the Women's Centre. That's actually directed. You can't see it there, but it's, you might make it out. It's Mr. President. It's actually to the clerk. And she says there, it ends, your government is doomed to failure and your apartheid system to the scrap heap of history. There's just some examples of some of the events that were held in Dublin, which was looking specifically at solidarity with South African women. There's a march that was happening, in March, and that involved Louise Asmal was heavily involved, as were other female members of the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement and the executive as well. This was actually, these were some letters that were sent to South Africa, that was sent to Joburg. There had been a march planned here in Pretoria, and it was cancelled later, and that was actually sent directly to the clerk. You can see from Louise Asmal, sir, the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement is appalled that your regime has decided to ban the women's march planned for tomorrow in Pretoria. It would appear to us that the watershed you announced in your inaugural speech has sadly no more substance than the Rubicon of your predecessor. We urge you to reverse the ban and allow the march to proceed as planned tomorrow without interference from the police or security forces. So the IAM, as I said, I think this just testifies to the fact that they really were writing to everyone, and that'll bear itself out now when I have a look at some examples related to the cultural boycott as well. And one thing is worth mentioning that particularly during the long run of the Dunstores strikes, there was one moment that really galvanised and I suppose really boosted morale, and that was in December 1985 when Bishop Desmond Tutu, he had vindicated the Dunstores strikers' efforts by taking a detour to Dublin while en route to collect his Nobel Peace Prize, and it really was a moral boost, and it ensured that the strikers continued their march. And at the time, an emboldened Mary Manning, she asserted that, quote unquote, we should have the moral right not to handle those goods, end quote. And this photograph here was actually taken while Desmond Tutu was in Ireland, and that's what he had a meeting with the executive of the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement. You can see Austin Flannery there, who was then president of the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement, and Louise Asmal there as well. Now, I want to move on to the cultural boycott, which was so enmeshed as well in terms of the economic and trade boycotts. So from its early years, and actually even while they had those early economic trade boycotts, the cultural boycotts were there right from the beginning as well. And the IAM placed cultural resistance at the heart of its activities, seeing culture as both a moral battleground and a means to mobilise solidarity across Irish society. While economic and sporting sanctions, particularly related to the Dunstores strikes and the Lions tours, the rugby Lions tours, often dominate public memory, the cultural boycott deserves equal attention. It represented a deep moral and intellectual challenge to apartheid and showcased Ireland's capacity for international activism during a period when the country was still developing its own post-colonial identity, having gained independence from British rule in 1922. One of the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement's earliest interventions in the cultural sphere was to seek support from notable Irish writers and playwrights, which the movement could then publicise. And many of these cultural figures saw parallels between Ireland's colonial past and South Africa's racial oppression, publicly declaring that they would not permit their plays to be performed before segregated audiences. A significant early success for the academic and cultural boycott was the campaign to persuade Irish playwrights to refuse to allow their plays to be performed before a segregated audience. In September 1964, 29 leading Irish playwrights joined the campaign. And the IAAM collection, Mayabuye, contains their original correspondence. So you hear, this was the response. So it was actually, generally it was Louise Asmal who was writing to the playwrights. And these are some of the responses. So I hope he needs no introduction, but that's the great Samuel Beckett, dramatist, playwright, Nobel Prize winner. And as he says here, dear Mrs. Asmal, you may include me in your list of playwrights refusing performance of their work before segregated audiences. Yours sincerely, Samuel Beckett. Now, there was also John B. Keane, the great John B. Keane. You might have heard The Field, starring Richard Harris. That was based on John B. Keane's play. And as he says here, dear Miss Asmal, please forgive my delay in answering your letter of last week. I had a play opening in Dublin and I've only just got back. I seem to have mislaid the membership form, which you kindly sent. However, I would love to become a member, and you will find enclosed a cheque for 2 guineas to cover the fee and small subscription. That's obviously membership of the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement. But I particularly like this one. This is interesting. He'd been invited to speak at an event for the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement, and he politely refused. He said, I'm afraid I won't be in Dublin until the 10th of September approx. I am honoured by your invitation to be your principal speaker, but to tell you the truth, I hardly feel qualified. Not yet, anyway. But you can count on me for any kind of support, moral, physical or rhetorical, from the middle of September onwards. I will not be leaving here to go anywhere till around that time. I am working on a play and must concentrate on that for my own mental welfare, inner content and literary release, etc. Hoping to hear from you again and to be of assistance when my labour is over. Yours sincerely, John B. Keane. Some of you may recognise this is Hilton Edwards and Micheál MacLeamore, who are the founding members of the Gate Theatre in Dublin. And they had written, Louise had written actually to Hilton Edwards, but I love this. It's a very self-deprecating sort of modest reply, whereby their secretary actually responds, but she says that poor Hilton is basically out of commission. He's quite ill and he can't respond. But he actually said, where is it here? That he is, of course, in sympathy with it, but he is not a playwright. She's basically got it wrong. He's not a playwright, although he did write 1 or 2 pieces. He was mainly a director, but he wouldn't take the title of playwright. But he did say Micheál MacLeamore is, in fact, there's Micheál, is a playwright, and I pass on your letter. And he wishes to inform. He now wishes me to inform you that he supports your boycott and will agree to it. From now on, none of his works will be presented in the Union of South Africa while the present regime pursue their policy of apartheid. That's Brian Friel. Some of you may have heard of Brian Friel, Derry-born playwright, obviously known for a number of works. But this is his response here. Dear Mrs. Asmal, I'm very pleased to be associated with the Anti-Apartheid Movement, and any help I can give to it through the contract clause you suggest is given wholeheartedly. And most of them actually provide their agents' details. Contact the agents, they'll sort it all out. Good luck to the cause, Brian Friel. This one, I think, is probably one of the most interesting replies. That's the great Sean O'Casey, Dublin playwright, known for works such as The Plough and the Stars. And he says, Mrs. Louise Asmal, dear Mrs. Asmal, put my name down since you wish it, though I can't believe it, or any other name, however important and big in fame, will have the slightest effect on the South African government. What's that say? The confidence they hold, the Afrikaners, he puts a D in there. The Afrikaners will hold all they have and will die on the veldt defending the right of property. The black people will get what is theirs only when they are strong enough to take it. Yours sincerely, Sean O'Casey. Now, growing support, as well as these, obviously, playwrights was very important. On the back of this, there was also a concurring movement to have a number of academics in Ireland support the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement. And this was demonstrated 2 years later when 150 Irish academics undertook not to take up posts in South Africa as long as apartheid lasted. These included leading scientists, historians, lawyers and administrators in Irish universities. The list of names was a roll call of Irish academics, many of whom broke their previous contacts with South Africa as a result. Now, this solidarity extended also to the visual arts in terms of the cultural boycott, where creative communities used their work to highlight human rights abuses and to insist that art must not be neutral in the face of injustice. To this end, the Artists Against Apartheid was particularly influential. Now, Arts Against Apartheid was an exhibition that was assembled by the Association of Artists of the World Against Apartheid. It was headed by artists Ernst Pignon Ernst and Antonio Suara, and it was in cooperation with the United Nations Special Committee Against Apartheid. Comprising of 85 works, the exhibition opened in Paris. I'll show you that in a little bit. I told you on medieval historian slides. Weren't around the 12th century. So it had opened in Paris in 1983, the exhibition itself, after which it travelled to various other parts of the world. And the show featured works by celebrated international artists of the 1970s and the 80s, including Joe Tilson, Roy Lichtenstein, Saul Levitt, and Malangatana Nguyenwa. So that there, that is actually that was a contribution by an Irish artist, Louis Lebrocki, who I'll talk about in a second. But first, it's worth mentioning that in the preface to the exhibition catalogue, which included Jacques Derrida's famous essay, Racism's Last Word, Ernst Pignon Ernst and Antonio Suara wrote that, quote unquote, the collection offered here, those 85 works, will form the basis of a future museum against apartheid. And that ambition has yet to be realised. But those posters, they're all, I think, Pramesh, they're all in my buoy, aren't they? Yeah. Yeah, the artworks are. So the IAAM collection actually contains a full exhibition catalogue, which you can see there, which includes, obviously, Derrida's essay, as well as correspondence with Irish painter Louis Lebrocki, which you can see here. And this letter here, he's writing, you can see, to the director of the Douglas Hyde Gallery in Trinity College, Dublin, and he was encouraging him to basically do an exhibition, a small-scale exhibition based on those artworks in Trinity College. You can see Lebrocki's inimitable wisping handwriting there and that. Now, the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement, they kept meticulous records of entertainers, actors and other cultural figures who performed in South Africa, helping to shame those who bypassed the boycott. And Kader and Louise Asmal frequently wrote letters to local and international artists, educating them about apartheid and encouraging them to refuse to perform in South Africa and to declare their public support for the anti-apartheid movement. The IAAM also took part in maintaining an international register, which was coordinated through the United Nations, which listed entertainers and performers who had broken the boycott by touring in South Africa. And Irish activists used this list to apply moral pressure on artists and to ensure that public figures were held accountable for their choices. And those who refused to engage with apartheid institutions, on the other hand, they're publicly praised for their integrity. Now, I'm going to show you some examples of these artists who are contacted, and it really attests to the variety of artists that the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement contacted. So you'll see you'll see some local artists, people like Joe Dolan, who some of you may have heard of here. My friend from Dublin, you've definitely heard of Joe Dolan, have you? You're not a fan anyway. Yeah, that's it, yeah. And some of you may have heard of Krista Berg, Lady in Red. They're writing to Krista Berg. So there are some local examples, but they're also writing to global superstars as well. Here you'll have an example of a letter that was sent to Harry Belafonte, Elton John, and also Satima Benjamin, and this was actually sent from Kader. As he says here, best wishes to you and Abdullah, your brother from Stanger, Kader Asmal, chairman. Now, this cultural monitoring meant that artists were subject to public censure and faced reputational consequences for legitimising the regime. As a result, artists contacted the IAAM for the latest information regarding the cultural boycott. And here, for example, where's my friends from U2? Oh, yes, there we go. So you'll see here, this is a letter sent to Kader Asmal to the Law Department in Trinity College from Paul McGuinness. For all you U2 fans in the crowd, you'll probably know that Paul McGuinness was the fifth member of U2. He was their manager. And you can see here that he's writing to Kader and saying, so this is August 1991, in the past U2 have of course observed the cultural boycott of the Republic of South Africa. We have not performed there or allowed our records to be released there. They circulate instead as imports at inflated prices. As you can see from the attached letter, there is strong demand from the company for a change in policy. We are about to release a new album in October, which was Achtung Baby. Should we be thinking about a change of policy? I would very much appreciate your advice on this sensitive matter. It has always been my position in the past that we should observe the wishes of the ANC. Is there a change of position imminent? With best regards, Paul McGuinness. So it's interesting, you know, the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement, they were taken seriously, clearly, you know. I think that really testifies to it there. Now, despite its successes, the cultural boycott was not without its complications. Some artists objected to restrictions on the basis of creative freedom, arguing that engagement could foster dialogue. Others felt that focusing on South Africa diverted attention from domestic issues in Ireland, particularly in Northern Ireland. Moreover, measuring the direct effect of a cultural boycott can be inherently difficult. Its influence was largely moral and symbolic, contributing to a climate of international condemnation rather than producing immediate political change in South Africa. Nonetheless, symbols matter, and in the case of apartheid, the withdrawal of cultural recognition of the apartheid state proved an essential part of its eventual delegitimisation. The cultural boycott of South Africa, as waged by the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement, was a profound example of moral activism expressed through art, education, and everyday culture. By insisting that there could be no separation between aesthetics and ethics, Irish activists turned culture into a tool of conscience. Through the refusal to perform, collaborate, or teach under conditions of racial segregation, the IAAM and its supporters affirmed that cultural freedom must rest on human freedom. Their efforts not only helped isolate the apartheid regime, but also shaped Ireland's own self-image as a nation willing to act on principle, even when such action came at a cost. The cultural boycott left a deep imprint on Ireland's political identity. It reinforced the notion that a small nation, shaped by its own colonial history, could act as a voice for justice abroad. It also established a lasting connection between Irish and South African activists, many of whom continued to collaborate after 1994. In retrospect, the Irish cultural boycott of the apartheid state stands as a testament to how creative expression, moral conviction, and political activism can combine to challenge injustice, proving that culture, when guided by conscience, can be a force for profound social change. That's actually another example there for any fans of Sinead O'Connor. This was a tribute concert that was actually held for Nelson Mandela on the occasion of his 70th birthday, and there are lists of some of the artists who play, including the great Christy Moore, Rory Gallagher, and Sinead O'Connor. And that was Sinead O'Connor's team's response about the contributing to that concert. Now, in November 1988, Albie Sachs was in London for recovery and rehabilitation after a car bomb attack by South African security forces in Maputo, Mozambique in April of that year. During this time, Sachs was approached by the ANC to develop his idea of a constitution for a post-apartheid South Africa. The ANC recommended that he work with Kader Asmal to compose a first draft of a Bill of Rights. And it was in the Asmal family home in Dublin, almost 6,000 miles away in the other hemisphere, that Albie Sachs, Kader, and Louise Asmal set about drafting a Bill of Rights for the people of South Africa. And that is a plaque that was unveiled, and it was actually unveiled by Louise and Albie after Kader's death outside the family home there in 1988. It was drafted, but it was unveiled after Kader passed in 2011. Now, today, the Bill of Rights is, quote unquote, according to the Constitution, a cornerstone of democracy in South Africa. It enshrines the rights of all people in our country and affirms the democratic values of human dignity, equality and freedom. And I just think it's a nice example of the work of the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement, and so much of their efforts, I suppose, came to the fore in that document there. Now, in conclusion, the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement collection at the University of the Western Cape, Robben Island Museum, Mayabuye Archives, is nothing short of extraordinary. Its breadth and scope are unparalleled amongst other collections and papers related to the IAAM held in archives elsewhere. Our partnership between the Little Museum of Dublin and the University of the Western Cape, the Centre for Humanities Research, and that exhibition is entitled Together Apart. And it merely scratches the surface of the IAM collection held at the archives. More than providing an overview of the IAAM and its archival collection, I sincerely hope that this lecture acts as a clarion call of sorts for new research projects related to the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement, which will vindicate the efforts of the movement and its members. In particular, Kader and Louise Asmal, whose foresight and ambition have safeguarded the history and legacy of the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement for future generations, ensuring that we do not forget the importance of international solidarity and cooperation in the ongoing struggle against oppression in the world today. Thank you. And I should say that that's actually a photograph from the collection, and that was actually the photograph taken in Kader and Louise's house the day Mandela was released there. So you can see an ebullient Kader and the rest celebrating. I'm happy to take questions. It might be worth Premesh joining us if anyone has any questions in terms of the exhibition or anything like that. I'm sure Premesh will be interested to contribute as well.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
The massive effort you've put in over the past few weeks working through this very, very comprehensive collection. It is really astounding to see how much work went into building this solidarity campaign and how many people were involved in knitting together a very complex movement. I think you've given us a good sense of what that archive holds and what is possible in thinking through that archive. There's one element of it, maybe two, that I think you and I both stumbled upon as we worked through the archive, and it's been troubling me since. The one is the analysis of apartheid. And there are several of Kader's lectures, and they are deeply committed academic and political reckonings with this problem of apartheid, something that I think we have not gotten hold of in this country. So 30-odd years after apartheid's demise, we are still struggling to make sense of how it is that this form of governmentality, this modernization of a political rationality of race, holds us in such a grip of despair and a sense of impasse. And reading through Kader's papers, there's one lecture that he presented in Delhi, in which he's trying to make sense of this dual configuration of apartheid, something that I've also been, struggling and worrying about. It's this notion of grand and petty apartheid. And, he makes the comment that, petty apartheid is not the site of a political struggle. It's actually grand apartheid. And as a legal thinker, jurisprudential thinker, he's saying, well, apartheid has been declared illegal at the UN, but we must find a way of making legal what is illegal. And that's a formulation that is made by a student activist in 1985 with Dalla Omar, who held that that was the most important statement that came out of the student movement in 1985, that we must make legal what is illegal. And I wonder how much of that statement is stands in contradiction to the texture of the cultural and everyday quality of the anti-apartheid movement. So petty apartheid would have to be addressed at the level of culture.
Yeah.
It would have to take into account the everyday, the banal, the mundane. And yet, we thought that apartheid was the superstructure of law, or only the superstructure of law. So it's just that difficulty that I think we're going to have to work through as we think about this archive. The other is Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
And, the exchange with Jerry Adams, I know you haven't put this in because it's a really difficult set of questions to negotiate. But, there is a difficulty around questions of violence and the use of violence and so on that I think we're going to have to think through very carefully. And how we represent that is going to be very telling. If I can just say, it's very fitting that, just hearing you speak, Kader spent his last days in an office in the Center for Humanities Research. He complained about everything, the dust, the noise. He was a real curmudgeon. But at the same time, his commitment to education was, by then he had already become Minister of Education in the South African cabinet. His commitment to education was second to none, and I am hoping that somewhere in this exhibitionary process, we'll be able to pick up on the theme of education and what it means for us now.
Because that element we've talked about, how we were trying to conceive of the exhibition and how we would curate it, that idea of being in exile and having that space, in a sense, to think about it not being here, and how do you actually come to terms with that, about that kind of distance as well, which is a really important aspect of it as well, particularly in relation to ideas of grand and petty apartheid.
Thank you very much for a good analysis. But I have, the first question is, are you limiting your source only to Maibuye archive? Are you only limiting it to source only in Maibuye area in South Africa?
Yeah.
No. So
No.
you're looking at it, and then I will pick back quickly. You see, because I've done this, and I can see something that I'm missing, something you can hide.
Yeah.
You can hide it. First is what is the context of this? Ireland doesn't wake up and say they are sympathetic to the ANC. They didn't wake up. If you know the history, go back to Jan Smuts and go back down.
Yeah.
You get one. So if you foreground that, you will see the critical thing. It's like Kader himself singularly changed Irish foreign and historical trajectory, because before then, Irish was really pro-Boer.
Yeah.
You get what I mean? Him single-handedly, it changed. So that is, if you foreground that, it's like, that is very important. For that, because he did it himself through talking to people, educating people one-on-one before Trinity got hold of it. So that is very important. And then going there, situating it like that, then you go a little bit, if you rely on what is here, it's good, but it's not enough, because what you find, like what is mentioned about violence, I have, personally in myself, I have posters that depict Nelson Mandela and Bobby Sands. And it's very important because it's violence, because there Mandela explained the result to violence.
Yeah.
And the result is more like the way Amilcar Cabral can talk. I'm not a military man, I'm just an activist who is militant. That's something, because I was going to use it for an exhibition just at Bobrigan. And then I was advised that, look, in the context of North-South, it's not politically valid, but you might want to use it, because that's why I say, are you looking at the archive there? Because in Dublin, the National Library, the National Archive, they have virtually nothing on anti-apartheid, but there is enough at Ulster, the National Museum of Northern Ireland. There's enough. There are posters, there are cards, and that is one important thing I think your narrative a little bit is missing. How, despite the North-South divide, it's like Gaelic football. It's a pan-island movement. You get what I mean? It's like anti-slavery in Ireland. It's a pan-island. So you want to, and again, are you not doing oral history? Because there are people living in Dublin. I introduced you to my dad in Dublin, who lived through all this. They know everybody. This is official, but they know Kader Asmal, they know the wife, they know when Mandela came, they know how they raise money. And funding. Who funds it? Nigerian Embassy funds it, if you look at the record. Because Nigerian Embassy actually provided the money, took them to London, financed it. Because then, you can imagine that early 70s, 80s. Even now, few African embassies are in Ireland. But Nigeria is very prominent since the 60s and 30s and stuff like that. So I think you might want to look at that and to interview people. If you know Connolly Bookshop. Yeah, if you go to Connolly Bookshop, you find those old people. Some of them, if it's not there, because that is the actually people who are working with Kader, who will come to South Africa, bring posters, small good things for Kader, coming from Dublin. You know, so if you can see there, and so those two places, Connolly Bookshop, and if you get back to Dublin,
I know Connolly Bookshop. It's a good left-wing bookshop in Temple Bar. I know it well.
Bar. So you can then go find, you can get resources there, oral history, and then you can find Jude. Jude Oud is a big man. He's born in Dublin. He's this mother and child African issue. You get what? So that is, you might want to look at that. I'm just putting that in. Thank you.
So I'm delighted you asked that question because, as I said earlier, the focus of this was basically on the IAAM collection here in Mayabuye Archives. To answer your question, the first one, no, we're not just relying on Mayabuye. We're also looking at, for example, I know you're saying that there isn't a lot. There are some personal papers that contain a lot of material related to the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement in institutions in Dublin, for example. I know there's some good material up north as well, which we will consult. So, for example, Terence McCaughey, who was the Presbyterian he was the Reverend and the Irish professor who I mentioned and for one-time president. His papers, for example, all entirely related just to the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement are in the National Library of Ireland. So I'm consulting, the purpose of this lecture was just purposely to look at this. So for Terence McCaughey. But he was a president for a number of years. He was a colleague of Kader's in Trinity, but his papers are in the National Library of Ireland. So I'm consulting them when I go back. The priority was to see this material because there hasn't been, as I said, there's been very, very little engagement with it. But no, don't worry. You'll sleep well tonight. I'm not looking solely at Mayabuye. I'm looking at other stuff as well. Particularly, as you say, the visual material is very important. So that nexus, as you say, between kind of the struggle and then also the armed struggle. I mean, it's something that we're still dealing with and reconciling with in our own history in Ireland as well. What was the second part of the question you were asking me? So you were asking about... Oh, yeah. So the other elements will come into as well. Purely for the purpose of this lecture, I just want to focus on kind of some of the findings in the collection. But no, don't worry. We are going to look at other archives as well.
How you contextualize this in like contemporary, like we're seeing, really devastating things happening within Congo, Sudan, Palestine. So bringing back this awareness of what has been done in the past, I think can be a very powerful thing for people currently, because a lot of people feel like they don't have the courage or they don't have, the support to sort of fight against these systems. But, just the example that you had shared of the DUNS employees, that's a very powerful thing that anyone can sort of do. And how are you going to sort of like contextualize this study within what we're currently going through to be able to sort of mobilize people who want to do something of such significance?
Yeah, so I suppose one of the motivations that myself and Pramesh have talked to is that, and I hope I said it quite clearly and explicitly at the end, is that idea that it's easy to forget about, important pillars of democracy, of fairness, of equality. And as you said, there's so many examples of oppressive states and societies that exist throughout the world today. And in some ways, so just for context, the museum I work in, it's our focus is social cultural history. It's called the Little Museum of Dublin. Now, just to kind of broaden the focus a bit. So in the Little Museum of Dublin, our focus is obviously Dublin, but obviously national and international contexts and themes as well. So in terms of our exhibition programs, for instance, our summer, in terms of our Irish summer, our Northern Hemisphere summer of, going from kind of late spring through the summer months, that would be our busiest time. And I'm always thinking from, a curatorial point of view, I don't take for granted that, we're just a cultural institution that provides, interest and entertainment for locals and tourists in our country. As I said, culture that has a conscience. So the idea of the exhibition was, in an implied way, while the focus on the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement, there are similarities to what's happening across the world today, you know, and hopefully they won't be too implicit, that people won't realise those connections. So, you know, that's something that, you know, was very much important to when I thought about this. And, you know, it was a story. I can't remember now how when I first came across Kader Asmal and his connections here to South Africa. But then I just thought, you know, the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement is an incredible organisation, particularly in relation to people power. And that's what's so important. As you say, sometimes people can feel, you know, downtrodden and desolate. And and it's giving people the examples like the Dunstore strikers, for instance. Like almost 3 years effectively of strike action was incredible. Now they were financially supported by, for example, the trade unions, and others actually would donate funds to actually pay those strikers to sustain the strike. I mean, they didn't just do the strike and not get paid and be able to support themselves and their families at home. They were financially supported by organisations and individuals as well, and IDAF was a big financial supporter as well. So that's sort of how it underpins those international contexts and, I suppose, contemporary contexts today. So that's what we're trying to do as part of it in an implied way. I mean, I think it's very difficult to draw specific comparisons with specific examples of state oppression today, because inevitably you will have to leave somebody out. So rather than doing it in a very explicit overt way of saying this is very similar to X, it's implied.
My question was kind of framed along what you've just spoken about now, about the little museum, and to give us a bit of context around that, and how you imagine the exhibition will be situated there. And so I suppose you've kind of answered a little bit about that now. But I also thought it was quite interesting, the parallels, like the importance of the trade union in Ireland, because in the anti-apartheid struggle here in South Africa too, right? The trade union plays an important role in terms of thinking about the racial struggle here in South Africa. But also I think it's quite important how you also brought in the women's liberation movement and to kind of spotlight that, because often, of course, right, these kinds of other movements are often in the back burner when it comes to, you know, the major racial struggle. And so I think, you know, having that component in there is actually quite important.
So in terms of our exhibition program, just thinking about the museum as well, that kind of late spring, summer exhibition that we have, it lasts around 5 months. And that's when we get most of our local and international audiences in particular. So in general, we get around over 100,000 visitors to the Little Museum every year. So it's a very busy place, and, you know, people from across the globe visit the museum. So that exhibition in the kind of late spring, summer always gets the most attention nationally and internationally. So that's why I thought it was an important one to do it on the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement. And it's our first one in the context of the museum. We've basically undergone a renovation project, so we were closed for over about 1.5 years. So this is our first kind of redeveloped exhibition program, where we are doing these kind of 2 exhibitions a year, one being kind of the focus as having more international interest or themes. And I just thought, you know, it's so timely. And last year we missed the boat because the museum was closed, but last year was the 60th anniversary, obviously, of the founding of the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement. And we'd hoped to do something last year, but it didn't work out because of renovations.
And I'm trying to think how to formulate this question properly, but just taking us to the here and now today, and possibly dovetailing a bit on I forgot the name of the lady in front here, but just do you think that and is there anything similar today? Any example where perhaps I should put it this way: do you think that today there would have been the same traction? You sort of touched on things about the situation in Ireland, obviously, you know, rights of women and to be fair, and we're not going to digress onto that today, you know, in this lecture, presumably, but because, you know, arguably Ireland took a lot longer in some areas, even, we had liberation here for women's rights, in certain instances more, and Ireland's taken a bit longer in some areas. But what I'm thinking of is, do you think that the circumstances, or what was it of the circumstances that allowed the traction to be so significant then? And would something similar today, and I apologize for being so long-winded, but I'm trying to formulate it correctly, because there is such injustice. There are some terrible things. We've all touched on them, already. We're well aware of. And yet, are we seeing that same traction today? And why is... It's amazing what you just showed us. The letters, the people that they could reach, the consciousness that they could reach. And can that be done today? Is it being done? And if not, why not?
Well, as I said to Premesh, I said, my God, can you imagine the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement's reach if they had social media? Because one interesting thing, I mean, there's so many aspects, and I know that gentleman, sorry, you didn't say her name, the gentleman with the glasses? Ulu. You were asking about things like the Boer War, for example. There were Irish men involved in the Boer War, for example. And in Dublin, near Stephen's Green, the Fusiliers' Arch, that is a memorial to Irish people who died during the Boer War, for example. So it is complicated. And going even way back further, in 1808, the Jij Rebellion in October, was that 25th of October, 1808, with Louis van Mauritius. 2 Irish sailors were involved in that slave rebellion in 1808. As well, so the history is complicated, obviously as well. Just because that was one thing I remember you mentioned about the Boer War, which I didn't address. One thing, for instance, it's the reach. I think the reach and the appetite to actually disseminate the information was quite extraordinary. There's a lot. It's quite interesting that in the 60s, when obviously Kader was involved in the founding of the British Anti-Apartheid Movement in 1960, before he had come to Ireland. The Irish society in which himself and Louise integrated into, it was quite poor. It was an impoverished society. We'd only become a free state in 22 and a republic in 49. So, life was difficult. I think it gave people, a way to get out of themselves, probably, and a lot of their own struggles. As I said, for example, Mary Manning, there was a directedness, there was a sense of, building upon the movement. So Mary Manning, for example, it wasn't out of a moral imperative that she did not handle those outspan grapefruits. It was because she was told to do it by her union. And then because of that, she learned more about the anti-apartheid struggle. And then it became a moral imperative for her, which it still is today. Mary, and sorry, you mentioned as well, was I interviewing people? We are interviewing people. Mary Manning, actually, I have a meeting with Mary Manning and a couple of other Dunstore strikers when I get back to Dublin. Rafiq Mottiar, who was the treasurer of the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement, is still around. Sadly, a lot of the members are deceased, but some of the younger members, for example, John Burton, who is in some of the photographs, she was involved as a young woman. She later became the leader of the Labour Party in Ireland. John's still around. So we're also engaging in interviews as well as part of that. But it's hard to know if it. I suppose the question is, would a comparable organisation exist today? A lot of the members, for example, Mary Manning is very vocal in terms of what's happening in Gaza at the moment. She's very vocal in interviews. You can see podcasts with her today, with her speaking about Gaza and other issues. But that goes right back. There's a lot of those members who were involved in the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement. Even when it ended, when it formally closed, I think it was in '94, when the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement was officially wound up, so to speak. Those members still remain part and involved in solidarity struggles across the globe, particularly in relation, as I said, to Palestine. It's hard to comment on those sort of what-if questions, but I think in some ways we see what's happening in terms of social media, media dissemination, in terms of other conflicts, global conflicts in the world today, and I've no doubt that if the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement were around today and its members, God knows who they'd reach in terms of their correspondence. One of the interesting things was actually 2 members of the movement had written to the executive of the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement, requesting that they no longer be members. And it was on the grounds that the movement had published their accounts, and something like 75 or 80% of the expenses of the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement was on postage and stationery. And the members weren't happy because that's where their money was going, that they thought it was going to charities in South Africa. But I think one of them, and actually Kader wrote back and giving the three reasons, or I suppose the raison d'etre of the movement, and one of them was the dissemination of information regarding the apartheid state.
I just wanted to ask you about your work in Maibuya. Obviously, Maibuya's archives hold a lot of material related to European anti-apartheid movements, including German anti-apartheid movements, the Dutch anti-apartheid. Yeah. And I'm wondering, in your research, if you've seen a difference in the collections associated with the Irish anti-apartheid movement versus the German or the Dutch anti-apartheid movements. And difference here in the broad sense, if there's any kind of threads that you picked up that differed, if you did come across some of the other material.
So my question is around the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement, and specifically the region in which it was situated in, given the fact it was, at the time, very conflictual space. So how did the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement respond to the domestic issues of the time, and were there moments of solidarity between movements in Ireland and in Northern Ireland and the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement?
I don't often encounter that we speak about movement building here, even in specifically like what does it mean to movement build. But what I received and I'm appreciative of is the generosity and the empathy that you spoke about from the Irish, and the texture of that in solidarity movements, and what it brings to the way that we relate, and then how to consider what it means to movement build in our specific context, thinking about how we relate. So I really appreciated that. And then the other thing that stood out was about that white people, I think that's what he said about the famous guy, about the rights of property. And how
the playwright, was it?
Yeah. And how that remains the case, that the rights of property are still kind of on human rights.
Yeah, Sean O'Casey, was it that one there where he said the Afrikaners will hold all they have and die on the veldt, defending the quote-unquote right of property. That one, was it?
Yeah.
Yeah, Sean O'Casey. And what were you asking about that? Or you're just highlighting it's
well,
interesting?
I think
it
remains the case.
Oh, yeah. Okay,
And I think how we relate to this also speaks to how we think about movement building now.
Yeah, thanks, sir. Firstly, Aidan, a very quick answer. We didn't have time to compare, unfortunately, with any of the other European movements, really. I mean, I'm actually like in the middle of doing the research in the archives, so I came here for, sadly, only 3 weeks. And as I said, anyone who's been in Maibuya and you know what those boxes look like, there's 87 of them just for the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement. Pramesh, did we get through 12? Pramesh got through 10, I only got through 2. But I mean, the material is just so interesting and varied. I mean, for example, there's minutes, there's boxes and boxes of minutes of meetings, things like that, which we didn't have time. So in some ways, with an exhibition in mind, we're sort of like, if we were able to write a dedicated monograph, which actually coincidentally, I think today it's being published. Conal Parr, he's an English academic historian, has published what is the first monograph on the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement through Oxford University Press. I think coincidentally it's actually being published today. So I'm not sure if Conal has actually engaged with the Maibuya stuff. It seems to me that actually, interestingly, you were asking about the oral history or the interview capacity. I know he's undertaken over 70 interviews with members. So a lot of it is based on oral history. But I actually, Aidan, I actually haven't had the chance to compare. We will, just for obviously in terms of the captions and the context of that exhibition. It's important to draw similarities with other European movements, but we didn't actually physically get a chance to look at them in here. I mean, the other thing is you're talking about, I mean, there's a wealth of other archives. For example, we didn't even get a chance to look at the Kader Asmal collection, which I'm sure there's plenty of material there as well. So that's why I said I hope this is a clarion call, because there's so much opportunity there. What are you doing, Aidan? Do you have the time to have a look into it? Oh, okay. Maybe next year. Thanks for your question, Aidan. La Cipo, was it? Yeah. So you're talking about kind of the regionality. One thing I didn't highlight probably, and I should have, is that although the movement headquarters and it was founded in Dublin, there were regional basically movements as well, you know, in Donegal, for example, up towards Northern Ireland. So there were other movements across the country, and they were engaging with each other as well. So in Belfast, there's supporters and sponsors there as well. Yeah, it was a complicated relationship, particularly with the political parties. So, like, for example, some of the early sponsors of the movement were, for instance, you know, as I mentioned, Mary Robinson, who was the President of Ireland, obviously a Labour Party candidate. There was also Michael D. Higgins, who was also another Labour Party member. Gareth Fitzgerald, who was Taoiseach, which is basically like our Prime Minister. He was leader of the government for Fine Gael. He was also a sponsor. And then also Sinn Féin, as Premesh mentioned. And there was a lot of issues, political issues, because actually at one point the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement was affiliated with Sinn Féin, or vice versa, rather, and that caused a lot of issues. And actually, as a result, Gareth Fitzgerald basically kind of removed his support, his explicit public support for the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement as Taoiseach, as leader of the government, because of that connection to Sinn Féin. Now, a lot of this stuff, I mean, myself and Premesh are still trying to make sense of and bear out. I mean, you can see there, just to give you that's like quite literally scratching the surface. It's incredible. So, you know, as we're working through the exhibition, it's going to be, as Moritz said, the exhibition is going to be in Dublin first for about 5 months, and then it's going to come to Cape Town. So you'll get to see it there, and I hope it touches on a lot of that stuff in terms of the relationship with the political parties, for example. And sorry, Sarah, so you were saying about the generosity and empathy. Yeah, I mean, as Kader says himself, he appreciated the generosity of the Irish people. But the other thing as well, I hate exceptionalism as well, you know what I mean? I suppose what I'm trying to do, and I was conscious as I was writing the lecture, I was like, I hope everyone's not like, oh, Ireland, aren't the Irish great? It's not about the exceptionalism of it, but it's just important to highlight just how important international solidarity and cooperation is, particularly in today's world. So I appreciate that you appreciate the generosity and the empathy, and I think that's really the key thing. As I said, it's about empathy, not pity, you know, and that's really key to things like dignity and the human condition. I hope that answered all those questions and comments. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Everybody, please join me in thanking him again. And please do join us for refreshments, and keep an eye on your email for future communications around lectures and events that we'll be doing through the chair and with the embassy.